So I work in a traditional newsroom, the old style, like it's a television newsroom. There was a time when we used to compete against, newspapers and other television broadcasters, but today it seems that we are competing with something out there that is a lot more anonymous, and in a lot of ways, after listening to Craig Silverman, a lot scarier, because it can be faceless and it can get very, very nasty. And because we live in this glass house and sometimes it's quite dark out there, we are targets of attacks, and we really don't know where they come from, and we don't understand why they are so passionately angry with us. We are just messengers. So we'll be covering very soon an election campaign. Somehow it's started already. You may have felt the overtones or undertones of that. And we've got three pretty smart people here who will be able to dissect all this and make some sense out of it, because I don't know if we really can make any sense out of it, and it's clear that we can't control it the way you could traditionally control the media. Well, we had people who read our scripts, who told us that they were grammar mistakes or factual errors, but today there is no such protections. You've got stuff out there that sometimes reaches more people than we do. And so we compete against that. And so let me introduce the three people here. Ed Greenspan has worked at the intersection of journalism and public policy forum for more than 30 years before becoming president and CEO of the Public Policy Forum. He was a journalist with the Globe and Mail, Bloomberg News, and newspapers in Western Canada, and he also wrote 2 books. David Coletto is one of the founding partners and the CEO of Abacus Data. Coletto has almost a decade of experience working in the marketing research industry and is an industry leader in online research, methodologies, public affairs research, corporate and organizational reputation studies, and youth research. And Kendall Anderson is currently acting executive director of the Samara Centre for Democracy, a nonpartisan charity dedicated to strengthening Canada's democracy. The Samara Centre produces innovative, action-oriented research that illuminates the evidence and reforms needed to make Canadian politics more accessible, responsive, and inclusive. So let me start with Ed. So this is how we're going to work. Feel free, once they finish their presentation, to ask questions. This is what you're here for, here to listen to them and to ask all the questions that you want. The microphone is here, just like before, so don't be shy. An old journalism professor once told me there are no stupid questions, only stupid answers, and you won't get them here. Ed?
Thank you, Joyce. Hi, everyone. So happy to be back at my alma mater. And I was going to say that I graduated in the class of 1946, but yesterday I was at the Broadbent Institute Progress Summit, and Ed Broadbent introduced me kindly as the 33-year-old president of the Public Policy Forum rather than the president of the 33-year-old Public Policy Forum. So I believe I'm now class of 2008, so I'm really happy about that. So I'm going to start with Justin Trudeau's conversion to Islam, and here it is. It was moved, a story that was created by the Vatican Inquirer, which I'm sure you're all is well read and in your something you look at, and then didn't get a big pickup, but spent some time on Facebook and Twitter when it came out. Here's the original situation. It's Justin Trudeau taking out his son for Halloween in 2016 as the Little Prince, and he's the pilot in the Little Prince, and so you can see the picture was cropped, reversed, and then the quote put on it, and an article put around that. So just, in terms of, the things that Craig was saying, this is an environment in which we live in. And, to me, the picture and the quote looked, particularly the picture, looked pretty convincing. So I just start there because I think that's where we should be all starting. Public Policy Forum's been doing a lot of work on two kind of intertwined issues. We kind of think of this like as a double helix in DNA terms of how do you sustain journalism, one, and two, how do you clean up the pollution in the internet of disinformation and hate. And I'm going to talk almost exclusively about the second, but I will just say that our report, The Shattered Mirror, which is on how to sustain journalism, although it also dealt with the disinformation issue. We're just updating some of the tables in it. And, since between 2016 and 18, another 173 newspapers have closed in Canada, 11 dailies and 162 weeklies closed or merged. The decline in revenues in the daily newspaper industry last year was 22%. That's the biggest decline ever, bigger than the 2008-2009 recession. And this is both good news and bad news, I would say, but it used to be that the relationship between the amount of revenue that the daily newspaper industry had and the amount of revenue that the CBC had was about 2.5 times to 1 for the daily newspapers. Last year it crossed the axis. So last year, daily newspapers collectively in Canada made $1.6 billion. The CBC made $1.8 billion, or had $1.8 billion with the parliamentary appropriation and their other revenues. So it's good that there's a strong CBC. It's bad if there's not enough diversity in the system, and that's an issue. And the final thing I would just mention is that I think we all love the New York Times and respect the New York Times. It kind of bothers me somehow or other that the New York Times has more subscribers in Canada than the Globe and Mail has in Canada. And the Globe and Mail, and these are figures that aren't normally made public. Philip Crawley from time to time says what the subscribers of the Globe, of globemail.com are. And 2 different points, people said different things about the New York Times. One, they said that it was, anyhow, it doesn't really matter how the math worked out, but the math, Neiman was able to figure out the math pretty easily. So New York Times employs 3 journalists in Canada. The Globe and Mail employs about 250 journalists in Canada. There's a problem there if the New York Times has more. Now I will go to disinformation and hate. We're here and we're talking about the election, and I think that's the most immediate thing, and probably, certainly most urgent. I don't know if it's most important or not, because the contents of the attacks that are occurring on people's knowledge of what's going on in their universe, their ability to be informed, it's being attacked on social cohesion grounds. The attempt to amplify divisions in society that is going on. We're seeing a lot of misogyny, we're seeing a lot of racism, we're seeing Islamophobia was mentioned earlier. We're seeing public safety issues. Alexander Bissonnette in the Quebec Mosque was, a guy wound up by things on the internet. I never heard of the incel movement before the Toronto driver, but that was a lonely, miserable, unhappy, mentally distressed individual who would have been isolated 20 years ago, but he found companionship and again got wound up. So the public safety issues, there's public health issues, as we're seeing with the anti-vaxxers, and measles this year is, the World Health Organization reported that it's the worst start of the year to measles in the last 3 decades. So all of these are important to think about. On the political side, Craig talked about, to some extent, Craig's work in terms of, what's going on within the ecosystem. The media ecosystem is incredibly important because in Canada we have very little research and very little knowledge of what goes on in that ecosystem. So we don't know who's playing and how they're playing. We've seen fake Facebook groups in the United States, but what fake Facebook groups are operating in Canada, we don't know, and we need a lot more work and a lot more research in there, and we're going to work on that. I want to talk about the audience for a moment. So when we did Shattered Mirror, we did six focus groups across the country in English and French, and what we found at every one, this weird thing happened. And the weird thing that happened was that people said, generally, they follow the news. They think they follow the news. They don't really want to be engaged with it every day. They feel guilty that they don't pay for it, but they don't want to pay for it. And then they would say that largely they get their news off Facebook. And then spontaneously, in every group, somebody then went, well, unless it's really important. And the moderator would go, well, what do you mean? And they said, well, if it's really important, I don't trust my friends and my family. And I remember in one group watching, and people said, well, Facebook doesn't have reporters. I want somebody to have reporters that go there. And the moderator said, well, what do you do in those cases when something's really important? And they said, if it's really important, and then they started naming what we might call news brands. They started naming anchors of television newscasts, both local and national. They started naming columnists with whom they were familiar. That's where they wanted to turn when something was important to them. So I kind of walked away thinking, what people want is a fire department of news. They want, they don't want to have to engage it every day. Their house isn't on fire every day. They're not interested in things every day. But when something's important to them, they damn well want that fire department to be responsive. So how do we finance a fire department of news is I think, a big challenge for what we do. The question is, what can you do about all this? And I guess that's the challenge for me. And I think there are things that you can do about it. And I think there's certain questions that are really, really tough, and we need to have a good national conversation about. And I don't know even, what I think about some of the trade-offs of a system that breeds distrust and misinformation and not knowing what's going on and sets people against each other, and the question of free speech. I'm not sure, precisely how I'd come down, but I do know that we need to have a conversation. I do know that some of the questions are easier than others. So the transparency question strikes me as being pretty darn easy. We've had a couple of measures around transparency which are positive. We don't, in the transparency stuff that we've seen so far, have where ads are being targeted. That's a problem. We don't have whether bots are being used to amplify messages. I think that's a problem. All these can be, dealt with. We don't even have a requirement, which exists certainly in broadcast and print, of who is the beneficial owner of a site. So, you got to say that to know who you sue. So that should be, mandatory. Algorithms, questions, micro-targeting questions, all those kinds of things strike me as not impossible to get at. And then, as I say, I think we need to have a conversation about the same conversation we had in the 1960s in Canada, which none of us remember, even me, but it was a conversation that led to anti-hate legislation. I don't know what everybody would think about anti-hate legislation. It's a restriction on free speech. In Canada, we have Section 1 of the Charter of Rights, and we have restrictions on advertising. We have restrictions on obscenity, pornography. We have restrictions on hate speech. So it's not like we haven't crossed that axis. It's like, where we should draw the line. Last point I'll just about the last point I'll make, I think, is so there's a question, and Kendall will speak to this, I think, in her remarks. There's a lot of talk about civic literacy, media literacy. Craig sort of told us he doesn't like those words because they're soporific, and I can get that. So I always think there's nothing wrong, and there's some things right with this, but I'm not too sure we can even get at the size of the problem. There was a wonderful book written, I think, in the 1980s by Neil Postman called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And in that book, he talks about how we get distracted. And he said, actually, the threat, he kind of goes for Aldous Huxley's Brave New World over George Orwell's 1984. He says the threat to democracy doesn't really come from people, banning books. it comes from us being overwhelmed with so much trivia and celebrity kind of trivia that we become distracted from the things that are important and that are civic. And I think that's a problem, but I don't know how the civic literacy, I just don't know how we build that up into something that's going to be material and meaningful. In the 1970s, Lake Erie was terribly polluted. People said the lake was going to die. That's a picture of Lake Erie there. And there were signs put up around Lake Erie that said, you know, bathers beware, don't go in the lake. And that's civic literacy to me, and that's necessary. But damn it, you gotta do something about the pollution in the lake. You can't just warn people, you gotta get at the source of the problem. And I think that's where policy needs to go. So I will shut it down at that, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. So my role here is to give a little bit of data. That's what I do. Abacus, we follow questions on how Canadians get their information, their news. It's something that's fascinating me. We almost can't take a snapshot without that snapshot becoming old and having to do it again because things are moving so quickly. But let me just share a few data points to set some context to really underscore, I think, what Craig shared and what Ed was talking about. When we ask Canadians, where do you get most of your national news? 52% say TV, 13% say Facebook, 12% say on a news website, 7% say radio, and 2% say Twitter. When we ask them, if a breaking news story happened in the world, where would you first hear about it? Most people say TV, but when you cut it down the middle, we're not right quite the middle, under 45, older 45, two very different worlds. If you're under 45, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, your primary breaking news source. If you're over 45, TV is still dominant. And so when we ask ourselves why are newspapers closing, if anyone is still relying on a newspaper for their breaking news, no one is, basically, is a big part of that. But let me share some other data. 29% of Canadians do not subscribe to cable or satellite. Among 30 and under, that's 44%. Okay, so we're an increasingly cord-cutting society. 40% of Canadians check Facebook at least more than once a day. 20% say they check it hourly. Okay, 62% check it daily. Only 40, now, in contrast, 54%, about just over half of Canadians say they watch some news on TV every day. So Facebook has as a platform, a much larger reach for news and information than TV, even though most Canadians say TV is their primary source. On average, Canadians estimate, this is their own estimate, that they spend about 15 minutes a day consuming content related to Canadian government or politics. 10 minutes among those under 30, 20 minutes among those over 60. So there's big gaps, as we expect, across ages. Now, if social media becomes such an important force in this, think about this. Only 8% of Canadians say they regularly follow journalists or politicians, and 8% say either one on social media. 17% regularly follow news organizations more broadly. Okay? And so the question I think we need to think about is, if we're going to combat fake news and misinformation, we have to really understand how people are getting their information. And so to Ed's point about, I love that analogy of the fire department and the news, is really apt. I see it in the data. And I lived it personally. A great story. So last year, for those of you who live here in Ottawa, you know we had tornadoes, which are very rare, made national news, story everywhere, right? And they happened on a Friday. And my sister, and I tell her I tell this story, so I'm allowed. She's 30. She lives in Toronto. She has a son. She owns a home. She's married. She is an adult, by all accounts. And on Monday, she texts me and she says, David, I heard about the tornadoes. Are you okay? Remember, tornadoes happened Friday. And I said, Stephanie, do you not love me? What did I do to you? We're pretty close. It's not like we're, distant. And she said, well, look, I didn't know until this morning that these happened. Think about that. Tornadoes in the nation's capital, which never happened, which caused significant damage to a number of communities. And she says 4 days later, I didn't even know. So I said, okay, well, I'm fine. Everything's okay. But I'm a researcher, and I want to know what the heck caused you not to know this. And she says, well, look, I don't listen to any live radio. I don't watch any live TV. I have no news apps on my phone to pop up. I didn't talk to Mom this weekend. And you did not post anything on Facebook. So how would I have known these would have happened? And so that personal story, and this is a real story, this is not me, it aligns with the data that I'm seeing, right? So if we think for a moment what all this means, what my sister who, yes, I think there's a generational difference. We can't just ignore and think all Canadians are consuming information in the same way. We're trying to uncover that difference across generation. But if we try to summarize it from the big picture, people rely, or they say they rely most on TV for their news, but are increasingly cutting that source of information from their household on a day-to-day basis. While they rely on social media for their breaking news, increasing numbers, few follow journalists or news organizations or even political leaders directly. So they're not getting it directly from the source. So they rely on their networks for their content. They either hear it from others, they hear it from me, there's tornadoes, I'm fine. So these two forces, cord cutting and social media, and reliance on social media news feeds for information, is creating conditions, I think, that allow for fake news and misinformation to spread and to be viewed as real, to be viewed as authentic. We are becoming a society that's, we've been talking about this, I think, since I've been a student at Carleton, highly fragmented, lacks a common news story, a common news source. Even if there's multiple news sources 20 or 30 years ago, there was a common thread tying that coverage together. That's not the case anymore. And I think we're increasingly reliant on our own networks to keep us informed about what's happening in the world, if we're informed at all. And I've got plenty of evidence to suggest we have no idea what's going on. And so being dependent on those networks means we can be infiltrated. Bots and fake accounts share fake news stories or offer up reactions. And this is important as someone who studies public opinion and the power of perceptions. The power for someone to see someone getting mad that Justin Trudeau did something that he didn't do. I don't verify that he did what he did. I just feel the emotion that somebody else feels. And so that spreads. And I share that emotion, and it becomes a wave that we don't even see because it's happening in a small corner of the country. But if it's happening in multiple places, it becomes significant. And so social media algorithms amplify those perspectives because we love emotion, and emotion's engaging. It drives us to the opposites, to the extremes as it's to the center, and it makes us actually believe more people hold extreme views than they actually do, which verifies our own instinct to hold those views as well, right? Or to blame some people over others. It polarizes us, it reinforces tribalism, and it further isolates us from a common story. And so it's not just news, though. If we think to 2019, the federal election, consumers or voters are changing, but so too are the political actors. They know it. They have to respond and connect with us in those ways. In his book called Prototype Politics, a political scientist at the University of North Carolina in the School of Media and Journalism identifies a broad contemporary shift towards technology-intensive campaigning that charts the ways that shift us, that has sweeping implications for the way that people practice politics and the work that campaigns and parties and the way that we interact with democracy. And so if you just look at the 2015 election as an example, the Liberals spent more than 4 times as much as the Tories on digital advertising and voter contact, digital voter contact. The financial reports show that overall they spent about equal numbers and more still on broadcast advertising, TV, radio, to some extent newspapers, but that the Liberals spent $8.8 million on other advertising. Our system, our infrastructure doesn't even capture, right? The way we report party spending doesn't even understand. The institutions aren't moving as fast as the parties are on this. Conservatives just spent $2 million on digital. We've seen the growth of Ontario Proud and North 99 and these third-party organizations that are producing content that aren't necessarily false or fake, but feeds into the void that exists, right, and takes advantage of it quite effectively. Many of us are going to get a text message this weekend from Andrew Scheer, right, that the politicians, they don't need you, Joyce, anymore. I know. They know they don't need you. And they'll go straight over the media's head, and they'll talk directly to us. And some of us will be like, what is going on? Who is this? This is spam. Why would you click a link from a... But some people will, right? And it'll connect with people. And so I think we're headed towards the first general election in which it's going to be our first digital first election. It's going to be the first one in which all of the parties will be doing more online that we won't even be able to see. And so when we talk about fake news and information, I think we have a responsibility also to hold our leaders accountable. Because as we're going to hear next, civic literacy doesn't appear to be improving. And so as a result, the power of a leader to pull his followers or her followers with them, I don't think has ever been as powerful. And I use this last example. If you look at public opinion research in the United States about who believes in free trade, for probably the last 30 years, Republicans have consistently been the most in favor of free trade agreements around the world. Until one day they nominate Donald Trump, who ran heavily on ripping up trade agreements around the world. Within months, the same polls that were saying Republicans were the most in favor of free trade now show them the most opposed. As someone who studies public opinion research, that's a remarkable shift in a very short period of time. And it shows that the power of leaders to pull those voters with them, to use those tools to convince them. And in a world where, and I did some research on this, people don't even know what causes climate change, how are you going to convince them that a carbon price is the best solution for it? And so I leave it with that, lots of data, and hand it off to Kendall.
So Craig spoke about a woman that I met in January, Maria Reza, and she's a journalist from the Philippines who has been under attack by her country for trying to get the truth about what is happening in the Philippines right now. And she came to Toronto a few months ago, and something that she said really stuck with me, which was that her answer to fake news was short term, you got to regulate social media. Medium term, you worry about media literacy, some of the things that Craig was talking about, like being vigilant and being intelligent about what you're seeing online. But that long term, what we really need to do is improve civic literacy. And I know that's super boring, and you're probably all saying, I remember that grade 10 civics class, and I hated it. But civic literacy is not only does it allow for people to understand what's happening and make decisions that might ultimately benefit them, but it also empowers people, right? It makes you feel like you can have some autonomy in your life, and you're not just sort of whipped around by the winds of fate. So it has sort of extra add-on benefits to it. The Samara Center for Democracy did investigate the state of civic literacy in Canada. So we wanted to figure out how do we define civic literacy on a much larger scale than just media literacy. This is something that is really problematic. How do we measure civic literacy? We did an investigation into civic literacy because we really do feel like civic literacy can be one cure and not the cure for an era of fake news and disinformation. We wanted to look at 4 areas that civic literacy can take place. So one is institutional knowledge. So this is the sort of stuff that you would learn in your civics class. What are the areas of government that are, or what are the 3 levels of government, and who's the prime minister, that kind of thing. Topical knowledge would be things like, what do you learn from the daily news cycle in terms of who is that prime minister? Okay, you maybe understand how the prime minister would work, but who is it today? Political ability is an area that is really an important one for people feeling that they can have an effect on the world. So this is, do you understand when you have a problem in government, do you understand who do you go to? How do you make that change? Do you talk to the media at a certain point? Do you talk to your MP? And then the fourth sort of section of this is that question of media literacy. Can you spot fake news? So what we wanted to do was say, like, how do all of these work together? And some people will be stronger in one area and stronger in another. But ultimately, what all of the research over the last 20 years has shown is that it's just, in all areas, really decreasing. And I think this sort of speaks to some of what David was talking about as well, where people like they're being bombarded with information. They don't know where to look anymore. They're being told that certain areas are untrustworthy. You can't trust, can't trust what you see on the internet. You can't trust, you can't. The media is being denigrated, and also, as Ed was talking about, really being underfunded. So, people's lives, which are already so busy, are becoming ever more so. And what it means is that their ability to kind of put these ideas together and figure out how do they move through the world, how do they make decisions when it comes to elections, becomes even more difficult. Well, I remember in the 2015 election, we were really concerned about apathy. Youth apathy was the big thing, and I think we all kind of wish that was the only thing that we had to worry about now. But I think it's a good reminder that thinking about fake news and misinformation is really important. But the other thing to add on to that is what are the reasons that people engage, and why do they decide to vote? Why do they decide to participate in their community? Why do they decide to break out of their bubble? And the things that we learn about deciding to vote are a sense of duty, which is declining in young people. The sense that you have to do something for external reasons is no longer there. Habit and social pressure, contact from anyone. So, contact from your political party or contact from, a malicious actor online. Those things will all kind of create an instinct for people to do something. But they really have, the biggest thing is they have to know that there's something at stake, that if they don't vote, it will matter. And I think that's where groups like Apathy's Boring and civics and things like that can make that connection with people to see, what you're doing, how you are behaving, what you're clicking on, what you're sharing, how you're voting does matter. We came up with a report card on the state of democracy last week. And there were just a couple points that I wanted to raise that I thought sort of resonated with what David and Ed have been saying, which is, people in Canada are interested in politics, and we thought, oh, maybe it's just that they're interested in Trump, but they are interested in national politics as well. They're interested in their provincial politics, and they do discuss politics online, to a limited extent, but they do. And I think that appetite is there for people to engage with politics. And so the question is, what do we do with it? And I think this is what David was saying as well, which is, if people want to get engaged somehow, it's up to, I think, politicians and journalists and media to make sure that they're getting good information and that they're getting a chance to not be manipulated by people who can sort of see these divisions between society. So I think that was all I wanted to say.